stand on constitutional reform?
I'm for it. I'm for it. Now, I think there's a legitimate argument over how you do it. You could. I'm not for having the legislature do it because I think their plate's full enough, frankly.
That's the article by article reform that we hear about?
Well, some people just propose having the legislature draft a new document. I'm not for that. I think that would probably consume the legislative session, and I think a legislature that can't pass, legislature that can't pass a budget and can't pass a sales tax bill that all say we agree on is not going to produce a new constitution. So I'm not for that. The other options I think people talk about is the Demetrius Newton option of having a constitutional convention. I support that. Now, every time I say that, people come back and say, well, Davis, do you have a clue what would happen if we had a constitutional convention? First of all, do you realize all that would happen is every interest group in the state would just run its own slate of candidates and put their own set of money on the table, and that it would turn into the most hyper-political, most ideological thing you've ever seen. It'd be even worse than partisan politics. Other people say, now, think about this. If we had a constitutional convention, how much time do you think we spend debating tax reform? How much time do you think we spend debating abortion? That's what a lot of people say to me. And what would make you think that we wouldn't spend the first 3 weeks of the convention debating the right to bear arms in Alabama? Or immigration.
You get wrapped around the axis real quick there.
Or gay marriage, or gay adoption, or you name it. A lot of people say, well, what's the assurance that that's not the stuff that bogged down a convention? And I'll tell you, I can't guarantee that it won't, but if you say you don't trust the political process to produce a good result, well, heck, none of us will run for anything. I mean, heck, I trust the voters in my district to vote for me every 2 years. If I run for another office, I'll trust them to consider me and evaluate me. It doesn't make sense to me to say I trust voters to evaluate me, but I don't trust them to evaluate a new constitution. So I think that there's an anti-democratic with a small d argument that's going on there. People say, well, we don't trust the voters to produce a set of delegates who produce a good constitution. That's anti-democratic to me with a small d. So I'm for a constitutional convention. And here's why I think we need it. 2 reasons. Local governments need to be able to govern. Whatever you think of what's going on in Jefferson County with the whole sewer dispute, whether you think the Slaughter option or the Jim White option or the David Bronner option is better, whether you're tired of hearing about all of it, Jefferson County ought to be able to make its own decisions. The commissioners and the voters in Jefferson County ought to be able to decide, and if the voters don't like what the commission does, they can reject in a referendum, they can vote all the commissioners out. Jefferson County should not have to go to Montgomery to get a good permission letter to do whatever it wants to do, when most of the other 66 counties don't care what happens in Jefferson County.
We have a lot of those bonds. We care.
Yeah, well, but you know that. A lot of voters living in the counties don't necessarily appreciate that. So, because some counties don't have the bonds. So, my sense is that local governments need to have the opportunity to govern themselves and to make taxing decisions and to make, because that's the root of why they have to go to Montgomery and make taxing decisions. Now, the 1901 Constitution, the premise of it was, we don't trust these rural counties to do the right thing. So we want Montgomery to have the veto power.
We want the smart people to be able to do it.
And we know, frankly, what the root of a lot of that was, because, we have short memories, but everyone forgets what happened a few years before 1901. The governor's race of 1898, when Reuben Cobb ran for governor and stitched together this coalition of blacks who were, by and large, allowed to vote in many Alabama counties at that time, and poor whites. And they almost elected him governor. In fact, they did elect him governor. I think the legislature overturned it. And people looked at the guys, and there was very few women, it was all guys, who crafted the 1901 Constitution and said, wait a minute, some of these counties, these former slaveholding counties and in the Black Belt in southwest Alabama, wonder 30 years from now who's going to be the majority in those counties. Wonder 40 years from now who's going to be the majority. And do we trust them to not tax the heck out of the industry that's there, out of the farmers that are there? Do we trust them to not tax the heck out of our kids and our grandparents who may be living there? No, we don't. So we're going to make sure that the aristocracy in Montgomery makes these decisions. Now, we've evolved way beyond that particular way of thinking, but some version of it still exists. And the version of it that still exists says that Montgomery ought to be able to overrule what counties want to do, and that is rooted in our Constitution. Now, the second thing, there are all kinds of other things about our tax structure that are rooted in the Constitution, and those ought to be political decisions that we make. Those decisions shouldn't have been made in 1901 and bind us in perpetuity. That'll be decisions that we get to debate anew, and that politicians and governors and legislators ought to get to think about anew. We ought to be able to have a robust conversation about property taxes in this state, and whether or not corporations are treated in an equitable way. We ought to be able to have those conversations about what our priorities ought to be in terms of how we arrange our tax obligations. We can't have that conversation if we're saddled by constitutional provisions that are 100 and, you do the math, 108 years, 107 years old. And third of all, this may be the most dicey one, but third of all, I think it would be helpful to have a constitutional convention in Alabama, because I think the debate over a new constitution would raise public understanding of how state government works. Now, I may be off in la-la land when I say that, but that is a hope that I have, that a debate over a new constitution would elevate interest in how government works, how our tax system works, and why it works that way. Right now, for example, a lot of people in Jefferson County, when we had a transit debate a few years ago, we're 24/7 bond and sue, we're in default now, but when we actually were in good enough financial health to contemplate doing other things, it's a big debate about transit in this community. And there's argument about, okay, well, how much does the federal government put on the table? How much can the county put on the table? How much do the municipalities put on the table? And people would sometimes say, well, why can't Montgomery put something on the table? Why? People would ask Siegelman when he was governor, and then they'd ask Riley, why can't Montgomery make a commitment? And a lot of folks didn't realize under Alabama's Constitution, you can't spend state dollars on transit, because Alabama Supreme Court has ruled that you can spend our state transportation dollars literally defined as roads and bridges and highways. Now, I'm not astonished by that, because in 1901 there was no light rail, and transit didn't exist as a term of art, and mass transit was not a term of art, so they weren't futurists.
And railroads were quite powerful.
Railroads were quite powerful, and the gist of it is that's a classic instance of a 1901 decision binding subsequent generations politically, and folks don't even realize that. So if we had an argument about those kinds of things, I think it would kind of refresh us politically. And I think it'd be a good exercise. So I am for a new constitution. I endorse a constitutional convention. I believe in that.